Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad that you could join us today. I'm Maren. I'll be your host for this webinar. Make sure that your microphones and web cameras are disabled during the presentation to provide a smooth webinar. During the presentation, if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. And you're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments and insights. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our upcoming webinars are will be on next Thursday. That'll be with Catherine Grant. She'll be giving a presentation on Family Search's gallery feature for memories. And then we'll be taking our holiday break, and then we'll return to the webinars on the 9th. And we'll hear from Susan Hoffman, and she'll be talking about naturalization. And there will be an updated calendar for January by the end of this month, so you can look forward to that. And I think that's all that we have for announcements. We will be having a schedule change in the new year. I believe that the schedule will be changing to Wednesday. We will send you updates via the email newsletter about that, as well as posting on our social media channels to let you know when and where you can access webinars in the new year. If you'd like to access a previous webinar, you can visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to the recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we're pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation on how to take better photos for genealogy. If you give me just a moment, we can set up that presentation and we'll get things started.
Great. Well, glad to be here again for another of the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. And we would remind everyone that these webinars are recorded and posted to our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel on youtube.com. We now have about 472 is the last number I looked at, videos up there. And of course, we'll keep producing them as we go along during the new year. Today, we're going to be talking about how to take better photos for genealogy. Something that perhaps you would like to know a little bit about. Of course, we're not trying to turn genealogists into professional photographers, although we would like to turn the professional photographers into genealogists, but that's kind of a different issue, and I'm not to that today. But we're going to move on here, and kind of the understatement of the beginning of this presentation is the technology has changed photography. It's changed just about everything else in life. It seems like that there's always some technological aspect to almost everything we do. So we do have some old cameras here with the bellows type focusing with that you moved in and out, the lens in and out to focus on the film at the back of that camera. And then we're going to show a new Canon digital camera. So that's sort of the jump from one type of camera to another. And the technology here is revolutionary in the sense that these cameras do not even have the same basic functions. The only really thing they have in common is a lens and a way to open and shut the light from coming to the light sensitive media. In this case, on an old camera, of course, film, and in a new camera, it would be a sensor, an electronic sensor that detects the light. So we have quite a range, and I would say even if you took this Canon camera that you see in the photo here, that it would be a lot of things would have changed on that type of camera, that there's newer ones than the one that's shown in this photograph. To remind people a little bit that the camera is a tool. It has a function, and it is a very specifically and in a lot of cases a very sophisticated tool, and it does require you to have some knowledge about how to use that tool. So we have a picture of some old tools here in the viewpoint, and I would guess that some of us would have difficulty in identifying how or why you would be using some of those tools. Some of them are very obvious, like the saw that's there on the wall. But some of the other tools perhaps are a little bit less familiar and have passed on to very, very specialized usage today by people who actually use the old tools for a variety of purposes other than just collecting them. Now, we need to understand, first of all, that we're not here trying to say that you have to buy into photography in any sense of the word. It's very obvious that there are people out there who become enamored with the technology or enamored with the cameras and spend many, many thousands of dollars on equipment. And they also like to help people think that all of that equipment is absolutely necessary. In other words, they could not do their job if they weren't using this high, very expensive camera or the very expensive equipment. And camera and becoming involved in photography is just an ideal, if you want to call it hobby or persuasion or even profession, for people who love the gadgets and love to accumulate a lot of equipment. Basically, you could there is no limit to the amount of money that you could spend on photography. They even come out with special edition cameras that are made out of gold, that are gold plated, that cost into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they actually sell to people. So by the way, they can take no better photo than many cameras costing just a few dollars. So you can take a perfectly adequate photos with a camera costing less than $500. The $500 is an arbitrary figure, and you can go much less than that and still have a very adequate photo camera. Especially if you're, for instance, not interested in being a photographer, not interested in selling photos professionally, then as a genealogist, basically all you want is a camera that will adequately reproduce the things that you need to have reproduced by taking pictures. That is your relatives taking photos of people and perhaps documents and or artifacts, historical memorabilia that you need to have to flesh out the histories of your ancestors. Perhaps you take pictures of the old homestead, the farm, cemeteries, photos. There's lots of ways that photography comes into play when we start doing genealogy, but none of that needs to be overly expensive. Important thing to understand here is that, and I'll come back to some equipment here in a little bit, but right now we're going to start talking about some basics. The technology really hasn't changed the basics of photography. Photography still has some very basic things that we have to be aware of. The first of those is the exposure, and we'll explain what that means, but it's basically having an adequately lighted photo so that you can see the detail and identify what it is that you're trying to take a picture of. And the next one is the focus, and that's very, very important because all of the detail can be lost by a picture that's out of focus. And I'm going to show some examples of these so that we know exactly what we're talking about. The third one is a little more esoteric in a sense because it's really something that depends on the personal feelings and the amount of artistic feeling that you have. And People can take good and bad photos simply by moving a few inches one way or the other. And what we call good photo and what we call a bad photo is highly subjective. And so, but it all falls under the category of composition, and that is how the items are arranged or placed in the plane of a photograph. When you're thinking of taking a photo, you have to think in terms of what it will look like when the scene is placed within the square rectangle of the photo itself, or the rectangular square of the photo. So when you're looking out at a scene, or you're looking at a group of people, or you're arranging people for a more formal photograph, the idea there is to ultimately have some idea of what happens when you click the shutter, and what happens to the arrangement, and what it will look like when it comes out onto the film, whenever it's developed in the sense of either being displayed as a digital photo or developed as a film from a film camera. Okay, so that's what we're thinking about in terms of the arrangement, or the way that the image actually appears as you look at it. And then the last one, and probably one of the most important, is camera movement. You can have everything, the exposure correct, the focus, you can have everything perfectly composed and have it in a very lovely setting or whatever, however you want to do the photo. But then when you move the camera, that's the end of the whole thing. In other words, you don't get a photo that's worth looking at, because it doesn't convey the information that you want to have. Now, there's one way of looking at photography, and that is that photography is a method of expression. In other words, a photograph ends up being a part of the way that the photographer views the world. It's a slice of his or her world view. So in a sense, the photography becomes an art, and it moves from being a technical subject into being an artistic subject. And we have obviously recognized that in our society, because we have galleries and museums and archives that have preserved photographs merely because they were taken by a certain person, or because they showed a certain type of emotion, and were things that were representative of a certain time period. So we'll have very famous photographers going back in time, people that would be names would be recognized among the general community of the people of the world. So there's it can become a very complex subject, but what we're trying to do here with this presentation, what I'm trying to do is bring it down to the level that there's some basic things we need to know, some basic things we need to do when we take a photograph, or when we try to preserve some memory or some document or something. And then those things are the basic things that have to be done. And if we don't do those basic things, whatever we've done is not worth preserving, is not worth keeping, because it's unreadable, or it's out of focus, or it's overexposed or underexposed or whatever. So now we're going to look at this. Now, exposure is the first level, and that is the amount of light that reaches the surface of that is going to record the image. In the case of an old photograph, it would be the film. And film went through a lot of stages. Started out actually with metal plates that we call daguerreotypes, where the chemical, primarily silver halide-based chemicals, were put onto a surface of metal. It went to glass. It then eventually, as other substrates were developed, they used treated paper. They also used celluloid film, all sorts of different kinds of substrates, of things that of which to capture the light. ultimately, the big revolution was when we switched from using a physical media for recording the light to a media, electronic media made up of discrete little sensors, tiny little electronic sensors that each recorded a little tiny portion of a picture and made it into a whole. And we'll look at that a little bit in another context. So that's another thing that I'll talk about here. So this is an overexposure. What this means essentially is that there's too much light reaching the sensor or the film, and it seems to look washed out. The bad part about this, and I may mention this more than once, obviously, is that there's no way to compensate for it, because when it gets, we call this blown out. In other words, once the media is blown out or overexposed, it basically cannot transmit any information, and there's not a whole lot you can do to bring this back down if this was the original photograph. So that's kind of the difficulty. Here's an underexposed photograph, the exact opposite. In other words, in this case, not enough light got to the sensor or the film to make an image. Fortunately, with a lot of digital tools in the digital world, underexposure is far less serious than overexposure. If you underexpose a photo, you can almost always, through software, third-party software, you can manipulate the image and gain back most of the information that was in the original image. However, on an overexposed image, the information is simply gone. It's not there. It was never recorded. And so there is no software that will bring back a highly or badly overexposed image. It will simply look like light still, no matter how you look at it. The thing about taking photos, and it's important here, is many of the photos, the cameras today have a way to instantly view the image. Just as soon as you take the image, you can look at it and see if it's okay. Well, the answer to solving most of those problems is to take advantage of that fact. And when you do take a picture with your digital camera, check it out before you get in a situation that you lose the opportunity to take the picture. So, for example, if you're taking a picture of a person, you might want to go back and take the person again, but if they've walked away, or if you've left or traveled or gone someplace, and then you may no longer have any access to that particular person or location or wherever it is that you are. So make sure that your pictures are being taken. I say that out of very personal experiences with the problem, because what happens to me occasionally is that my drive, my flash drive, or my micro SSD drive, solid state drive, will not have been put in the camera properly, and I can be taking a series of photos and I'm thinking I'm recording them and I'm not. And so I lose a whole segment of photos that I've taken or thought I've taken and have not taken. So there's a real reason for us periodically being very obsessive about making sure that once you've clicked that shutter, that the picture you have is being properly recorded in your camera. And most cameras will let you look back and go through the pictures so that you can see each one. Now, kind of from this point on in the presentation, I will make some very brief references to film, but I am not, from the reality is today is that most of the people will be taking pictures with a digital camera, almost exclusively, actually. There is a movement among photographers to go back to taking pictures with film. And once again, I would say if what you want to become is a photographer, and if that interests you, then that's something you might want to pursue. But on the other hand, if you're wanting to do this for genealogical purposes, for preserving family memories or preserving documents or whatever, then there's right now there's really no reason to to mess around with film. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and it certainly does not lend itself for sharing the images with other people. You only have one copy of an image. And if you make additional copies, then there's a problem with the degradation of the original copy of the images and things like that. So the reality of it is today is that almost exclusively digital imaging is going to become the way that we do photography. Now, focusing is an entirely different subject because it has nothing to do with the amount of light. You might have a perfectly good, balanced, wonderfully exposed picture, and it might be totally out of focus, like this one, and none of the details are visible. And there's another problem with this particular image that I picked out of the old pictures that I have around, and that is that the camera itself was defective and it was leaking light. Either the back of the camera was accidentally opened for a brief moment and thereby exposed the film, or the camera itself was defective, had some kind of leak of light, of crack in it or something, and leaked light in and got part of the photo completely overexposed and discolored. And so this part of the photo is where that's obviously bad. The whole photo, by the way, is out of focus. Now, what does it mean when it's in focus? Well, focusing the camera is a mechanical process of moving the position of the lens to where it creates a sharp image on the sensor or on the film. So it's a physical thing, and you actually have to either turn a knob. Most of the new cameras, by the way, any camera that you would be purchasing today, if you were just to go into one of the stores that sells cameras and just bought a camera, would have an automatic focus capability. It would be able to have a setting that when you push the button, the camera itself would focus on the particular subject. The problem with an autofocus camera is that you may end up focusing on the wrong subject, and so the one you're actually trying to take the picture of is out of focus. So that can also happen, and that's one of the hazards of relying too heavily on the equipment itself rather than using the information that you can supply by setting the camera properly for the photo. Camera movement is the difference between out of focus and camera movement is just sort of academic, because they both produce very fuzzy or in some cases completely undistinguishable pictures. You can't tell what's there because it's been moved too much. The camera itself is moved. You can tell that it has because it sometimes leaves a double slide off the side image. And if you were to zoom in on this particular photo, you would see that it was the results of having the camera out of focus, and not the lens was not improperly focused, but the camera itself was moved, and that's why the image is the way it is. There's actually a little bit of slide over on the images so that it took like the movement, like showing the movement of the camera. You get the same process, by the way, if the subject moves. So it's really not any different if the person were to move sideways or move across the camera focus, then you'd get the same problem. So either the camera or the movement of the person. So there are simple ways to avoid camera movement, and there are relatively not quite so simple ways to avoid improper exposures and things that are out of focus and badly composed pictures. So that's kind of what we'll talk about here as I go along. to avoid camera movement is fairly simple. If you're doing a lot of copying of documents or artifacts, you may want the structure on the right camera stand that has lights that are associated with the camera to give you an even light on the subject, and a upright pillar where the camera can be fastened and moved up and down to get the sharpest focus possible for the items that you're taking photos of. And this is a very good way to take photos. And then there's some other mechanical things that you need to know about to do this. As a matter of fact, my wife and I this past year spent a year in the year of 2018 at the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis, Maryland, digitizing records for Family Search. And we spent that whole year in front of a little more elaborate camera stand than the one shown in the picture, and with a bigger bank of lights and a fixed camera up there that was set at the exact point that would take the sharpest pictures. And so we were taking a whole long series of photographs. But the process of what we were doing as we were taking those photographs was maintaining the paper, the book, or the individual documents so that they were in focus. And it was something that you had to work with on every single time you took a photo. So we had to worry about the focus just continually. Fortunately, the software was quite sophisticated and eliminated most of the problems, but not all. So we had to monitor every photo, as I've indicated previously, and look at everything that was photographed. In fact, we went back through after we took a series of photos and reviewed every single photo individually to make sure that the image had been captured properly. On the left is a tripod. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of different kinds of tripods out there, and some are very complex and some are not. But basically, they'll all do the same thing, and that is they're designed to hold the camera steadily so that there's no camera movement when the photos are taken. If you are taking pictures of a family or of relatives or whatever, it's probably a good idea, unless you are extremely familiar with your camera and have a steady hand, to use a tripod, to use some way of keeping the camera steady so that the photos are not showing camera movement or being out of focus. Now we're going to talk a little bit about composition. You can tell something about composition when you see a photo like this. It's important that you understand what you're looking at here. I'm guessing from this old photograph that this was somebody's farm or homestead, and that the idea here was to have a picture of the house, that was the main focus of the photograph. Basically, what you got here was a photograph that looked like the person was standing on the side of a hill and a little bit sloped. Generally, that's just the manner of not having the camera straight. But on the other hand, if the idea here was to take a picture of the house, then why is there this big tree and why all the other things? Perhaps it was to show the yard, but in any event, there's lots of things about this photo that are important to understand that are we'd say are just a very poor example of composition. If the house was the main focus, then it would have been better had this person moved a few steps forward, taken the camera and set it on the fence and taken the picture of the house. Likely we would have had a much better picture of the housing structure of where these people lived than otherwise. If it was to show the whole farm, then perhaps he could have taken a few steps back and put the house into a context of where it was, and given us an idea of the size of the property. It would have been helpful also to move to the left a little bit in this photograph and get a little bit more of the front of the house. You'll see that the front of the house is pretty much in the shade, and so there's very few details right on the front of the house. So it might be helpful to move a little bit so that the front of the house is properly exposed and the house is visible. So there's quite a few things about this photo. Now the black things that are on the photo, those big black, that looks like bars or whatever on the corners, are the black film mounts. They're little gum stickers that they put on